Welcome to Lesson 6 of Module 223, Advanced Ethics, and in this video we're going to dive into the subject of privacy in more detail. It's kind of a numbers game in a way. The numbers 3 and 4 really matter when we look at privacy. There are 3 types of privacy we'll focus on, and I've got the order a little different than I did in the last video, but it doesn't really matter. We can talk about body privacy, informational privacy, which is also called confidentiality, and ownership, which is the privacy we associate with possessing things and spaces. So not just objects, but places that we really find to be important as well. And there are 4 people that we think about when we talk about privacy. Obviously, the people we support are part of the group, but we should also think about the privacy needs of our coworkers, the families and others who are stakeholders of the people we support, and the agencies where we work. Body privacy applies to anything that might be considered to invade the person's body, anything invasive. That can include a contact of a person's skin or inside of their body, such as injections, for example, or even intrusions into people's personal space. And also exposure. For example, if a person is expected to be undressed in front of other people, that's what we mean by exposure. Some examples of intrusions or invasive procedures include obviously things like surgery and needles, but also things like personal care and medications. They are literally invading the person's personal space and sometimes entering right in their body. When you're giving a person medicine, you're going into their body in a manner of speaking. People have the right to what we call informed consent. What this means is that we have to try to convey to people in an honest and understandable way what the implications are of the intrusive procedure. Whether it's medical or personal care, we need to tell people what we intend to do, and if there are risks associated with it, we have to take reasonable steps to make sure people are informed. Now you'll notice something that's kind of interesting. It doesn't say understood consent or tested for understanding. So it's up to us to try and deliver information in a way that is understandable and relatable. If you go to your pharmacist and you ask a pharmacist for the side effects of a medicine, and the pharmacist hands you one of his 5th-year textbooks, you're not going to feel like he's really done or she's done a really good job of informing you, because it's going to be full of all kinds of complex chemistry that most of us won't understand. So that pharmacist meets their needs in this particular category by giving you a sheet that summarizes or simplifies. And we have to do something similar. That pharmacist is not required to do some kind of a test later on, but they do usually do things as simple as asking you if you have any questions or whether you understood. Or maybe they point to the little label on the bottle and say, be aware of this particular side effect or this particular hazard. So we need to do the same things in our case. Now, in many cases, this means engaging people who are informed stakeholders for that person. Let's say we're working with somebody who has quite a profound level of intellectual disability. There's no really easy way to communicate to that person and find out if they understood what's going on. However, maybe that person's parents are really, really closely involved in their life. Even if that parent doesn't have legal authority to sign off for that individual, if the person has not got some kind of provision that stipulates that they cannot be involved, it's generally considered to be the right practice to involve people who have the best interest of that person and the most knowledge of that person in the process. That's kind of a reasonable way to make sure that we're getting informed consent. Another important portion of this body privacy idea is that people have the right to refuse. So that doesn't just happen at the beginning of a procedure. Let's say you're helping somebody with washing their hair, and partway through it, they tell you they don't want you to do it anymore. You need to stop as soon as safely possible, or ask somebody else to come and do it that is okay for that supported person. And the same thing is true of medical procedures. And again, you have to realize that this doesn't only refer to things that are physically touching. So for example, being around somebody who was undressing, even if you weren't close to them, might be something where a person's allowed to say, I don't want you here. Now there are some exceptions to that. For example, if you're in a changing room in a public swimming pool, typically that is not going to be possible. but in somebody's bedroom, it certainly would be a reasonable thing for them to ask you to leave. Another thing would be an example of somebody being in somebody else's personal space. For example, I've worked with people who got really upset when somebody who was a smoker went and stood in their personal space because it was really hard for them to tolerate that smell. So even though there wasn't touch, the individual had the right to say to that staff person, can you please sit on the other side of the table, or can I please have somebody else help? And we must recognize that people can't always do this verbally. Sometimes their behavior clearly tells us. So we have to acknowledge that behavior even if it's not in written form or perfectly verbal form. And of course, or at least I hope it's of course, there is no sexual contact allowed between a staff person, even a volunteer or any person in a position of authority, with a supported individual. Ever. Period. And generally speaking, we would not see that really anywhere in the workplace because of the fact that power differentials exist. So we have to make sure that we understand that that is an important principle, and also that it doesn't go away when the end of a shift occurs or when we leave the employer. We don't get to change the rules because we're no longer employed there. That condition continues. Confidentiality is all about information sharing. One of the common expressions you'll hear people use is that we only share information on a need-to-know basis. So what that means is that within our organizations, we're allowed to share information with relative ease on the proviso that by doing that, we're really providing for the safety and welfare of the person that's there. Let's pretend for a moment that you work in a relatively large organization that has decided to have a big picnic in a park in the middle of the summertime. People from all different programs are going to come to that park. While you're at the park, somebody else who works for your agency comes over and sits down and starts to talk with one of your supported individuals. You tell that staff person, oh, you probably don't want to get that close to that individual. They really don't like it when people are that close. It really causes them problems because that person's autism makes them very sensitive to touch, eye contact, and noise. Have you breached confidentiality? No, you haven't. That person works in your organization and you've shared just enough information to provide for the welfare of the supported person. On the other hand, if you are sitting there with that coworker and divulging all sorts of things about the supported person's family and finances, when there was no reasonable way that somebody would use that information down the road for any constructive, client-centered gain, then we'd have an issue. Now what happens if we're on our way home? We're on the bus and somebody sits down beside the individual and starts to talk to them. In that circumstance, what if you revealed the exact same amount of information? Have you breached confidentiality? Well, it turns out that you actually have, because all you needed to do was probably ask the person to create some space for that person without disclosing that person's diagnosis or medical history. So we have shared more than that person needs to know, and because they're outside of our agency, we have a challenge. But here's a third scenario for you. A person's mom comes and visits on the weekend. Let's pretend the person is 30 years old. And mom, let's pretend, is 55. Mom comes and she starts asking questions about the sex life of her 30-year-old child. Are you allowed to disclose that information? Generally, the answer is no. The only real exception to that is if mom has some kind of legal documentation that gives her what they call comiteeship, and that's very rare. So, if mom wants to know that information, she should probably go and ask her child in the exact same way as any mom should ask their own child, or else accept the fact that they probably won't know that information. So, mom doesn't need to know that. Well, we're still not done. What if mom says, hey, I'd like my son to come and visit for the weekend. I need to bring his medications with me. Can you tell me what medications he needs? Well, that's a scenario where you could clearly see there's a need to know. And you probably want to get the supported person's permission, but it's a case where you'll likely share that information. So you can see this idea of need to know is a principle that you have to apply to each scenario individually. Information sharing can also happen with written permission. So let's go back to the last scenario. In that scenario, let's pretend that the supported individual signs a letter that says, "My mom can know anything she wants to know about my medical history." Or let's say there's a written legal document that states that. As long as that document is legally approved, either scenario, then that written permission allows the sharing of information. This happens fairly often. In our physical disabilities module, we talked about community health professionals, such as mental health support teams. When an individual is served by a mental health support team, it's common for them to be asked to sign a waiver or an information sharing form. And even if an individual does not have a recognizable signature or is not intellectually at a high functioning level, they can still sign off on this because of the concept we talked about in the last slide of informed consent. If we tell them what the information is going to be used for and they sign off on it, now that information can be shared by people from different agencies and different disciplines. Again, no amount of documentation would allow us to share information for people about people without any client-centered purpose, without any need to know. So if I tricked an individual into signing a document so that I could give away their personal secrets to the National Enquirer, I would still not be okay. Information sharing and confidentiality don't only refer to the sharing specifically of the organization, but of the illicit sharing. In other words, accidentally letting people see information that they shouldn't. And that comes down to the way we store and manage our documents. So for example, I should not leave people who are not allowed to see information alone in a room where that information is accessible. For example, if it's posted on bulletin boards or in binders sitting on shelves. So they either need to leave the room when I leave, or those places need to be locked up and out of view so that they cannot access that information. Similarly, you should not be leaving information around where people who are not supposed to see it have access to it, such as in your home. Let's say you have a laptop computer and you decide to work on some documents that are for an individual you support. Well, it's typically considered to be not a great practice to do that on your personal computer, especially if you share it with other people, or to bring home a computer and leave it open where others can see it, or documents sat on the front seat of your car while you go grocery shopping. All of these would be examples of unethical behavior because you're supposed to be more careful. Those are negligent things to do. Sometimes we accidentally give information about people when we're giving a report about somebody else. So for example, imagine a scenario where there's a conflict between two supported individuals. If there was a fight between two people, we would be required to complete two separate incident reports. And this is something that many people don't understand. I cannot use the name of person B in person A's report. Nothing that identifies that person should be used. So I might have to use initials or simply refer to them as person B. And then I would write the comparable report on the other side for the other person. And so while it might be time consuming, it maintains the confidentiality of both people. In the short term, all the staff people supporting those two people already know who's involved, and both documents are going to be stored on site. But in the future, let's say both people move off to different destinations. We don't want that document to include information about somebody down the road who is not part of the service environment. So we don't include incidental information. Now, if there's two staff people on that form, that's one thing. That's fine. Staff people are basically giving permission to be included in those recordings, but not one supported individual for another person's report. Gossiping is almost always an example of a breach of confidentiality. Gossiping not only about supported people, about coworkers and their families are both examples of this. Sharing proprietary documents. Let's say you work in an agency and you decide that you like the mileage form that they use, or you like the computer software that they use. And so you bring it to another organization, or you bring it to your own business, especially if you claim it as your own. You're definitely violating this principle. And leaving documents around where other people can see them, as we said, is a violation of privacy. And in some cases, you could argue a violation of dignity. For example, I've gone into homes where people had bowel movement charts on the refrigerator, which has a whole host of problems, but certainly dignity and privacy should be at the top of the list. Finally is the concept of ownership. Ownership refers to people's possessions, artifacts we often call them, and spaces, such as their bathroom, their bedroom, their glove compartment, just to name a few. Some important rules. Staff people should never borrow from a supported person. And that includes when a person says to you that they want you to or they're okay with it. If there's a really big challenge involved there, and I think that's rare, then I would go to somebody at arm's length to make sure that the borrowing was acceptable and that there was some degree of accountability that the borrowed thing was returned and returned in good condition. By the way, it's also not a very good idea to lend people things, although that's more of a practice than an ethic. Locks, keys, and passwords are particularly important for us to understand. We use them all the time, and individuals that we support may also be able to use these things to maintain some privacy. And so I would encourage you to respect people's use of these things. Staff people sometimes have thought, well, I'm allowed to know the password unless you really need to know it, or unless there's a security concern. We allow people to use these things for themselves. Sometimes I ask people about this rule and they say it's the rule that one knocks before entering. But that is both a simplification of the rule and also it misses an important part of the rule. The rule actually is to knock and wait for permission before entering. So an individual has to state that they are willing to let you into that space, again, unless there's some kind of safety or security concern and urgency is there. And by the way, just like we talked about the right of a person to refuse body privacy intrusions later on, so can somebody revoke your permission for being in their personal space. So you enter only after the person is given that permission, and you stay only as long as the permission is given. You must have permission before accessing private spaces other than rooms. Those include things like the drawers in a person's dresser or opening up their photo album, for example. So it's really important for us to understand that ownership is a type of privacy, and if we do not respect it, for most people, it's like an intrusion upon themselves personally. And if you've ever had something stolen from you, even if it was something that wasn't of significant economic value, you probably know that feeling of being intruded upon or invaded. And it's the same for the people we support. So, take a moment and see if you can think of an example that I didn't give of confidentiality violation, body privacy violation, and an ownership violation. And think about what you would do in these cases. We'll talk further about those in our discussion in this case.